All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. So this will be an episode running through the various record highs, all-time record highs of energy demand in different categories for the world itself and for various countries and regions. You can leave this open in another tab and listen if you want to, because a lot of times it's just going to be a Google Earth shot of the country in question on screen. Petroleum, probably the first thing jumping to everybody's mind. The global record for oil demand was set back in the later 2010s, in 2018 or 2019, at a demand level of 102.2 million barrels per day. In terms of natural gas demand, the highest ever global total was set most recently as natural gas demand keeps increasing every year. And this time it had reached 404 billion cubic feet per day on average. Meanwhile, the story is the same with global electricity demand. Global electricity demand on average has now reached a level of 3.25 terawatts of active electricity demand across the global grid at any given moment. And global coal consumption for this past year, 2022, actually broke the previous record. The previous record being set back in 2013. Global coal consumption has resumed increasing and has broken through 8 billion tons per year, or at least this past year, were consumed in 2022. And under the umbrella of oil, the different fuel products, at least, because this is specifically record highs regarding energy demand, gasoline, the global record high of gasoline demand, at least in averages, was back in 2019, where the world averaged 24.5 million barrels per day of gasoline demand. And in terms of diesel, that record was also set in 2019 at 27.8 million barrels per day of diesel demand. And jet fuel was also set in 2019, just under 8 million barrels per day at 7.97. And in terms of fuel oil, used predominantly for large vessels at sea, such as container ships, bulk carriers, oil tankers, however, also used as fuel oil for oil-fired power plants, but that use is decreasing, which is why fuel oil's global high point was a while back in 2012 at 8.5 million barrels per day and has since declined into the area of around 6.5 in present day. So within a few years, fuel oil's number will be composed of only fuel oil for marine vessels, which, at least as of right now, would probably be between 5.5 and 6 million barrels per day. Now, going through individual countries, keep in mind, not every country releases exact monthly or weekly specific data that I can get a hold of, so some of them are just record high yearly averages. If a particular set of data is a very specific high point, like it was reached during one specific week or for one specific month, then I will specify that. For the US, averaging in present day around roughly 20 to 21 million barrels per day, its highest ever oil demand moment for one specific week back in 2021, I believe it was all the way up to 23.18 million barrels per day. And within the individual products, gasoline, the highest ever moment of US gasoline demand for one specific week in the late 2010s was 10.03 million barrels per day. Diesel fuel, the highest it ever hit in terms of just diesel fuel as a fuel, a vehicle fuel for large vehicles. The highest ever point in the US one specific week in 2021 was 4.9 million barrels per day. The highest ever US jet fuel consumption levels were 2.18 million barrels per day back in, I believe, 2019 or 2018. In terms of natural gas, the highest ever average US gas consumption is the most recent one this last year, as US gas consumption, as with many other countries, is constantly increasing, and the US is up to averaging roughly 90 billion cubic feet per day, with much lower numbers in the spring and fall, and higher numbers in the summer, and very high numbers in the winter because of increased heating demand. The highest ever individual day for the US was 158 billion cubic feet consumed in a single day, and that was several years back in 2018, I think, or the winter from 2018 to 2019. In terms of electricity consumption, the US is relatively steady around an average of about 500 gigawatts of constant demand load, obviously fluctuating throughout the day and different at different times of year. Its highest ever individual moment on one specific hour was 743 gigawatts, set this past summer, and its highest ever low point, or during the trough of demand in the early hours of the morning when it should be lowest, its highest ever low point was just a few weeks back on a very cold night where demand only got down to 576 gigawatts. And in terms of coal, the US at one point back in the 2000s had a consumption rate of about 1.1 billion tons per year. However, the US is now down under 500, around like 400 million tons or so. China, in one specific month back in 2020 or 2021, hit a demand high point in terms of petroleum consumption of 17.5 million barrels per day. Otherwise, they average around 15 or so. In terms of natural gas consumption, their highest ever levels were set in 2021 at over 38 billion cubic feet per day. And it actually, oddly enough, looks like their gas consumption decreased by a tiny bit this past year, but we'll have to wait and see for that data. In terms of electricity, their highest ever at the moment, not average, but at the moment, level was set this past summer during a particularly hot period, and they hit 1.1 terawatts of electricity demand load on their grid at one particular time for just one single country. And in terms of coal consumption, they make up over 30% of the world's coal consumption at 2.9 billion tons a year. Then we have India. Their highest ever demand level was set last year, 2021, I believe, at 5.6 million barrels per day. Their highest ever electricity demand level in the moment, one particular hour, was set this last year on a particularly hot day nationwide, where they hit 218 gigawatts of active demand load at one point, whereas their average is usually around 180. And their record high coal consumption is their most recent numbers, almost up to around 700, currently just a bit under 680 million tons per year. Japan, their highest ever demand level of oil was a couple decades ago at just above 6 million barrels per day. Nowadays, they're more usually down a bit under 4. Their highest ever level of gas demand was about 12.5 billion cubic feet per day in 2014. Their highest ever electricity demand level, just an average, was averaging around 120 gigawatts of active demand at any given point, and that was back in the 2000s. And their highest ever level of coal consumption was very recently, actually in 2017, at about 172 million tons consumed that year. However, both their gas consumption and coal consumption are going back down very quickly now, as in 2021, and then even further by a huge amount last year, 2022. They have finally been restarting their nuclear reactors. South Korea, their oil demand record high was set a couple years back at just over 3.1 million barrels per day. Their gas consumption is gradually increasing, not a drastic upward slope like everybody else's is, but their high point not too long ago was 6.2 billion cubic feet per day. Their electricity demand is constantly increasing, though, with their average electricity demand now hitting a new high of around 67. Their highest ever coal consumption levels were set back in 2018, though, at a consumption level that year of 122 million tons. Russia, their highest ever oil demand level was 5.1 million barrels per day of domestic consumption back in the 80s. And that's not for the USSR, not for the whole USSR, just specifically for Russia itself within the USSR. Their highest ever gas demand is their current one, averaging about 47.5 billion cubic feet per day. And their highest ever electricity demand levels are also their most recent ones, or at least their pre-February ones, as this is 2021 data, and they were up to roughly 116 gigawatts of active demand. And their highest ever level of coal consumption was back in 2012, and that was 140 million tons consumed that year for them. Brazil set their highest oil demand levels most recently at just above 2.8 million barrels per day. And in terms of their electricity demand, at least their highest average, that was their most recent one, which is averaging around 71 to 72 gigawatts on their grid. Indonesia, their highest ever oil demand level for one specific month, a specific moment, was 2.4 million barrels per day, and that was set this last year in 2022. Their natural gas consumption levels were at their highest at 4.6 billion cubic feet per day in 2015. Their electricity demand is constantly increasing as they are constantly bringing electricity to all of their citizens across the country, and their highest was their most recent average of now just above 34 gigawatts nationwide constantly of demand. And their highest ever level of coal consumption was pre-2020 in 2019, where they consumed 115 million tons that year. Vietnam, their highest ever oil demand, at least their highest ever average, was just before 2020 happened, where they almost hit 600,000 barrels per day, getting up to 599. Their natural gas consumption hit a high point of 1 billion cubic feet per day in 2015. Their electricity, we do have specific monthly data for, and their highest ever monthly demand level or monthly average was set just this year, or this past year, I mean, in the summer, and they averaged about 34 gigawatts of demand versus their regular normal time average of about 28 or so. And Vietnam's highest ever level of coal consumption was about 72 million tons per year. Taiwan's highest ever level of oil demand was around 1.1 million barrels per day or so. Their highest ever gas demand was their most recent level, as they are still increasing, coming in at 2.7 billion cubic feet per day of consumption for their most recent natural gas data. Their highest ever level of electricity demand was their most recent average, as they are still increasing, now at an average of 32 gigawatts on their grid at any given time. And their highest ever level of coal demand or coal consumption was about 57 million tons in 1 year. For Mexico, their highest ever level of oil demand, domestic consumption, in one specific month was 2.2 million barrels per day back in 2011. Their highest ever level of gas demand was their most recent one, and their most recent average was 8.8 billion cubic feet per day. Their highest ever electricity demand levels, at least on an average, were back in 2019, in which they averaged about 38 gigawatts. South Africa has been on its way economically down for a bit of time now. Their highest ever oil demand levels were set back in 2015 at 710,000 barrels per day. Their highest ever electricity usage levels were set during one specific month way back in 2008 at 33.3 gigawatts, and their highest ever level of coal consumption in 1 year was in either 2010 or 2011 at 128 million tons. The UAE over in the Persian Gulf, their highest ever level of domestic oil consumption was back in the mid 2010s at an average for that year of 1.02 million barrels per day. Their highest ever level of gas demand, natural gas demand, was about 7 billion cubic feet per day, and that was set back in 2017. Their highest ever level of electricity usage, however, at least average, is their most recent levels, as they are constantly increasing because they're constantly building and doing new stuff because that's how they spend their oil money. and their most recent averages were roughly 15 gigawatts of demand. Saudi Arabia hit a all-time high of oil demand of just under 4 million barrels per day of domestic consumption back in 2016, coming in at 3.96. And since then, they've actually decreased by over a million barrels per day because of switching electricity generation from oil-fired power plants over to natural gas-fired power plants. And speaking of which, their highest ever natural gas consumption levels, you could guess, were their most recent ones, now averaging about 12 billion cubic feet per day. And their highest ever electricity demand levels were also their most recent average of close to 40 gigawatts now. Egypt set their highest ever oil demand record back in 2015. The average during one specific month of that year hit 947,000 barrels per day, whereas their natural gas and electricity demand records are their most recent numbers, with their gas demand levels now up over 6 billion cubic feet per day at 6.2, and their average electricity grid demand levels usually being now up to around 23 gigawatts. Canada set their highest ever oil demand levels at 2.65 million barrels per day back in 2019. Their highest ever natural gas demand levels were their most recent levels, now at an average of about 12 billion cubic feet. And their highest ever electricity demand levels were set back in the late 2010s, coming in close to 80 gigawatts of demand. Australia set their highest oil demand levels back in 2018 at 1.15 million barrels per day, with their highest ever natural gas demand levels, at least on average, being in 2019 at about 4.5 billion cubic feet per day. Their highest ever electricity demand levels also came in 2019, where they had an average of 29 gigawatts, and their highest ever level of coal consumption was back in the 2000s before they started switching over to gas-fired power plants, where one particular year they had a consumption level of 72 million tons for that year. Pakistan set their highest ever oil demand levels in 2017, averaging 589,000 for that year. Their highest ever natural gas demand levels, however, were their most recent average of now 4.5 billion cubic feet per day, and their electricity demand record was also their most recent average of now about 17 gigawatts of demand on the grid at any given time. Malaysia set their highest ever oil demand levels in 2019 when they averaged close to 900,000 at 882. Their highest ever natural gas demand levels in 2015, where they averaged 4.7 billion cubic feet per day, and their highest ever electricity demand levels also were back in 2019, where they averaged close to 20 gigawatts of demand. Europe as a whole, we will break it down in a moment, don't worry. Europe as a whole, excluding Russia and Belarus, including Turkey, though it is included in the regional data, Europe as a whole set a all-time oil demand record a few years back in 2018 at 15.32 million barrels per day for the entire continental region, since which they've been gradually declining. Their highest ever natural gas demand levels were back in 2011 at about 58 billion cubic feet per day, since which they have been gradually decreasing towards about 50 or so. Their highest ever electricity demand level, their highest ever average, was their 2018 average demand level of about 450 gigawatts on their grid. And their highest ever year of coal consumption was 2012, where they consumed about 551 million tons. Now, breaking that down into the major European economies, the UK had their highest ever oil demand level back in the 70s at 2.22 million barrels per day. Their highest ever natural gas demand levels in 2011, at which they were just above 8 billion cubic feet per day of demand. Their highest ever electricity demand levels, on average at least, was about 48 gigawatts, and their highest ever coal consumption level was about 55 million tons in one year during 2012. Germany had their highest ever oil demand level set during the late 70s at 3.3 million barrels per day. Their highest ever natural gas demand level was their most recent one at an average of 9 billion cubic feet per day. And their highest ever electricity demand level, at least for the average across the year, was in 2017, averaging 71 gigawatts of demand on the grid. Their highest ever consumption of coal for 1 year was set back in 2013 at 117 million tons consumed that year. France, like the UK, also set their highest ever oil demand level in the 70s at 2.5 million barrels per day, and their electricity demand level record, their record high, set as the average during one specific month back in either 2010 or 2011, was about 87 gigawatts. Turkey's highest ever oil demand level was set in 2021 at 1.24 million barrels per day during one specific month. Their highest ever gas demand level was actually back during 2010 or 2011 at 5.5 billion cubic feet per day. Their highest ever electricity demand level was set just this last year during one specific month, where the monthly average jumped up to 43 gigawatts, and their highest ever level of coal consumption was set during 2019 at just under 60 million tons consumed that year. Italy's highest ever level of oil demand was during the 80s at 2.02 million barrels per day. Their highest ever level of gas demand was back around 2010 or 2011 at 7.5 billion cubic feet per day, and their highest ever spike in electricity demand for the average of one specific month back during the mid 2000s was up to 40 gigawatts of demand on the grid. Polska, set their record high of oil demand last year in 2022, getting up to 807,000 barrels per day. Their natural gas demand record is also their most recent one, although it's not that high, about 2.3. Their record high electricity demand was set as the moment average of one specific month back in 2017, at which their demand jumped up to 23 gigawatts, and their highest ever level of coal consumption was in 2010 or 2011 at almost 80 million tons that year. And the last one of the majors, at least, Spain, their highest ever level of oil demand was in the mid 2000s at 1.6 million barrels per day. Their highest ever level of gas demand was back in 2019 at 3.6 billion cubic feet per day. And their highest ever level of electricity demand was a jump up during one particular month back in the 2000s, up to 38 gigawatts of demand on their grid. Now, back outside of Europe, Argentina set their highest ever level of oil demand back in 2014, one specific monthly average, getting up to 751,000. Their highest ever level of gas demand was about 5 billion cubic feet per day back in 2018, and their highest ever electricity demand levels were their most recent average of between 16 and 17 gigawatts of demand on their grid now. Venezuela, highest ever oil demand level was back in the mid 2010s before they collapsed at about 830,000 barrels per day. Highest ever level of gas demand was about 4 billion cubic feet per day in 2018. And their highest ever level of electricity demand on average was also in the mid 2010s before they collapsed, and which was about 14 gigawatts of demand. Kazakhstan's highest ever oil demand levels were 345,000 barrels per day in 2019. Their highest ever level of gas demand was only 1.7 billion cubic feet per day back in 2020. The highest point of their electricity demand was their most recent level of now averaging 12 gigawatts on their grid, and their highest ever year of coal consumption was 2018, in which they consumed 57 million tons. Iraq's highest ever oil demand levels were set this last year, 2022, during one specific month in which they got up to 968,000 barrels per day, and their highest ever electricity demand levels are their most recent average, which is now up to 12 gigawatts of demand at any given time. Iran's highest ever level of oil consumption on average was about 1.88 million barrels per day a couple of years ago in the mid to late 2010s. Their highest ever level of gas demand is their current level of gas demand, which is 24 billion cubic feet per day, and their highest ever level of electricity demand is their current average level of electricity demand, which is just under 40 gigawatts. Nigeria only has oil data, and their highest ever level of oil consumption was set during the mid to late 2010s during which in one specific month they jumped up to 820,000 barrels per day. Back over in the Persian Gulf, Qatar set their highest ever level of oil demand during the 2010s at 369,000 barrels per day during one specific month. Their highest ever level of gas consumption is about the same as their current average, which remains pretty constant at 4 billion cubic feet per day. Their highest ever level of electricity demand, like with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the others, is still increasing and is now up to averaging about 5.5 gigawatts. Kuwait had their highest ever oil demand levels back in 2011 at 566,000 barrels per day before they started switching over to gas-fired power generation, which dropped them from averaging in the 500s down to averaging in the low 400s. Their highest ever gas demand levels were their most recent averages, which is about 2.5 billion cubic feet per day, and their highest ever electricity usage levels were their most recent average, which is now about 9 gigawatts of demand on their grid. Chile, over in South America, set their highest ever oil demand record in either 2021 or last year in 2022 at 430,000 barrels per day. Their highest ever level of gas demand was only about 500 million cubic feet per day, or about 0.6, set back in 2019. And their highest ever electricity demand levels on their grid are their most recent averages of around 9.5 gigawatts. Their northern neighbor, Peru, set their highest ever oil demand level just this last year at 287,000 barrels per day, and their highest ever electricity demand levels are also their most recent averages of just over 6 gigawatts of demand on their national grid. Thailand set their highest ever oil demand levels in the later 2010s at 1.37 million barrels per day. Their highest ever level of gas demand was in 2015 at about 5 billion cubic feet per day. Their highest ever level of electricity demand was not their most recent average, actually their average back during 2019 of about 20 gigawatts of active demand. And their highest ever level of coal consumption was during 2021, about 27 million tons that year. The Philippines set their highest ever oil demand level back in 2019 during one specific month, getting up to 507,000 barrels per day. Their highest ever level of electricity demand is their most recent averages, now averaging about 12 gigawatts of demand across the country. And their highest ever level of coal consumption was in 2021, in which they consumed 27 million tons. Colombia set their highest ever oil demand levels in 2021, averaging 370,000 barrels per day. Their highest ever gas demand levels back in 2020 at only 1.3 billion cubic feet per day, and their highest ever electricity demand levels are their most recent current averages of about 9 gigawatts. Algeria, over in North Africa, had their highest ever oil demand level at 460,000 barrels per day during one specific month in the 2010s. Their highest ever gas consumption levels are their most recent and current averages of about 4.6 billion cubic feet per day, as well as their electricity demand levels being their most recent current averages of about 9.5 gigawatts of active demand. For the entire continent of Africa, minus Algeria, Egypt, and South Africa. So, in the absence of those three countries, the entire rest of the continent of Africa has hit their highest ever oil consumption level in 2019 at 1.87 million barrels per day. Continent-wide in total, it was actually just above 4 million barrels per day, but those four countries, I forgot Nigeria, those four countries, Algeria, Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria, comprise more than half of Africa's oil demand and also more than half of its electricity demand. As in the case of Africa's electricity demand for the entire continent, minus only Algeria, Egypt, and South Africa, the entire rest of the continent, Nigeria included, hit their highest point most recently of averaging still only about 40 gigawatts of active demand continent-wide. And Central America, so Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Central America had their highest ever level of oil demand in 2019, averaging between all of them put together about 454,000 barrels per day. and their highest ever level of electricity demand, all of them put together, is their most recent combined average of only around 7 gigawatts, all of them combined. Okay, that's it for this one, and my voice is tired anyways, so thank you everybody for listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are there if you want to support me, only do so if you actually can. You can also go subscribe to my cat's channel, help us try to get her up to 1,000 subs at some point. But no matter what happens to me, may God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.